Good to be back among friends, good to be back in Melbourne. What I'll do is that at the risk of some personal publicity, I'll begin with an anecdote just to share with you how I came to this subject. There's a book project that I'm currently involved in. It is looking at 7 decades of independent India, the reflections, and with a very distinguished colleague. And among the various papers that we wanted to have for this book, there was one that we wanted for a very notable Indian economist who is now in a very senior public policy position in India, and for obvious reasons I'm not taking the name. And when I got around to this gentleman with whom I worked for several years and I wanted him to write a paper on Indian manufacturing, he said, I've written so much on Indian manufacturing, nothing changes. Can't I write on 3.5 years of Modi? I said, sir, this is a book on 7 decades of India. And you're talking about 3.5 years of Modi. He said, but 3.5 years of Modi is so special. I said, okay, we'll leave that for India at 75. By that time, Modi might have had a few more years to him. But anyway, the reason why I shared this with you is to just let you know about the fact that in India, outside India, among people who follow India, among those who are interested in India, today's India is very, very connected to Modi, in the sense that no conversation about India in the social or economic or political discourse is actually possible without alluding to Modi. This was 2014 when Prime Minister Modi was elected, and am I doing this correctly? Yeah. This was, if you could see this, the election results between 2009 and 2014. On your left is what happened in 2009 when Manmohan Singh came back. Not audible? Okay, let me try to. Am I better now?
Yeah, this is just for the camera.
Okay. So, in 2009 when Manmohan Singh came back for the second time, he was leading a coalition. He was leading a coalition government with various partners, mostly important regional parties. And the orange patches were what the BJP was in 2009. And if you look at 2014, you can see how the landscape has changed. It was a phenomenal change, leading to a situation where in the lower house of the Indian Parliament, for the first time since Rajiv Gandhi in 1984, this was the first complete absolute majority which a political party on its own obtained in a general election to the Indian Parliament. So between BJP, which won 282 seats, and its allies, there was a number of 336 out of 544 seats in the lower house, giving Mr. Modi the complete authority. And he didn't have to worry about surviving at all, which has been an issue with the governments that he succeeded in the past for the last 25 years. Why did the Congress lose? I mean, a lot has been spoken and told on this, but by and large, these were the major issues that didn't click with the electorate. It was an angry electorate. After 10 years of the UPA Congress rule, corruption, law and order, there was an economic slump that was precipitating. And this phrase called policy paralysis, that nothing in India moves, no policies get implemented, everything gets stuck midway. This became a very fashionable term to be used by businesses, by commentators, by practically almost everybody, even civil society, that there was a complete policy paralysis, and Manmohan Singh and his team were incapable of taking this forward in any way. There was a very poor perception of the Congress leadership of the day at that point in time, and it was perceived as a dour leadership, no sort of rigor, no vigor, no ability to recharge the potential of a country which was having a demographic dividend that was supposedly the largest in the world. And on the back of it, you had this man coming in, and he was pitchforked into India's Prime Ministership scenario within a period of barely 6 months from the last state election that he won. And that was 2012 December in Gujarat, when he got elected for the 3rd time as the Chief Minister of Gujarat. And within 5 months of that, or 6 months of that, the BJP kind of decided that this is going to be the face for itself in the next general elections that it is going to face. So that was the beginning of Narendra Modi in his campaign for India. There was an anti-Congress wave. Mr. Modi and his team decided very early on that, look, there's no further coalition building that we are going to indulge in. Association with regional parties cripples the flexibility and authority that we might have in exercising decisions. So we are going to go ahead on our own, and we would like to capitalize the sentiments that are existing at this point in time. And if necessary, if religious divide or religious polarization could be a way of further capitalizing that dividend, so be it. But on top of everything, India clearly voted more for Mr. Modi than it voted for his party. And that was clearly the end result at the end of the day. He was a leader who could connect to the electorate, particularly the very large number of 18 plus young India voters that got to vote for the first time in the 2019 elections. It could connect to a large number of other disgruntled communities, including even possibly minorities in certain parts of India. So the Modi chapter began in India. And Mr. Modi is different. I mean, this is different in terms of certain stylistic facts about him. And why so? The first Indian Prime Minister to be born in independent India. Prior to him, everybody were products of colonial India, born in colonial India. The first Indian Prime Minister to be born in independent India. The longest serving Chief Minister to actually become Prime Minister. There was no other Prime Minister prior to him who actually got to serve as much time in the state governments and at its head as Mr. Modi did. So 3 clear terms. He was never a part of the central government before. I mean, for that matter, for the record, the BJP itself was a part of the central government in India's history before Modi came for only 5 to 6 years, and Mr. Modi was nowhere near the scheme of things of the government at the time. And Mr. Modi was not from Delhi. And this is interesting. This resonates as we go ahead and look forward further at Modi. Mr. Modi takes pride in the fact that he is a non-Delhi Prime Minister. And then he completely revolutionized the use of social media in his political campaign to the extent that he relies upon social media as a one-on-one form of contact with people. So all the intermediaries, in today's India, the Press Information Bureau releases have become secondary or even tertiary. The primary impression is what comes out of the office of the Prime Minister on Facebook, on Twitter, and even on the various apps that he has built for connecting with people, on which he takes impressions and policies. The first Prime Minister to actually get into a monthly radio broadcast, which is done on the last Tuesday or last Sunday of each month, which in Hindi parlance is called Man Ki Baat, you know, the words of the mind for connecting to people. And this, I think, finally, the last sentiment, vanguard of a muscular, proud India. I mean, this might have multiple interpretations. You're free to interpret in whichever way you can, but this is pretty much evident from the BJP manifesto that was brought out before the elections, which clearly had the imprint of Mr. Modi, that India will not remain any longer a quiet, inactive, passive player when it comes to developments around itself, developments with itself. It would be proud about itself. It would be happy to take its position in the scheme of things in the world wherever it rightfully belongs, and irrespective of the consequences in certain respect. And he began modifying India. Modifying India, of course, and now Mr. Modi, much of the appeal around him, the perception around him, the vision around him had to do with economics and business. Because I think, as we saw before, there was a prolonged period of policy paralysis. Economic reforms were stuck. A number of issues that made the businesses unhappy were pretty much visible on grounds. And I think one needs to appreciate the fact that the Manmohan Singh government, much as it could have moved actively on a number of areas, could not, because of the perception and corruption issues that it slowly got embroiled in. So much of the attention actually shifted to handling those matters rather than focusing on economic policy issues. But to that extent, Mr. Modi began with a very charged agenda. So this is actually this lion. I initially thought it was a tiger when I saw the logo for the first time. Later realized it's a lion. So it's Make in India. That's the Lion Make in India logo, Mr. Modi's signature campaign for making India a global manufacturing hub. The objectives of this: make India a $20 trillion economy in the medium term by 2030. Make in India is expected to be the signature tool for taking India towards that direction. Mr. Modi right after assumption of office, within 3 months, he said that today the investors talk about India in a very skeptical fashion because in the World Bank's rank of doing business, India is at 143. And my goal is to make India at least 50 within a period of 3 to 4 years from the time I assume office. So the latest World Bank rankings put India at 100. So there's been a sharp jump from last year to this year, rank of 30 places. He wants to make India a totally digitalized country where all functions are done through the technological appliances in forms of the smartphones and the other digital tools that are available to people. And this is clearly in terms of flushing away all intermediation that are there in the middle and which probably affect the quality of service delivery. He embarked on a very ambitious financial inclusion scheme which called the Jan Dhan Yojana, trying to get the entire country banked, because in terms of statistics, it's remarkable that by the year 2014, only 30% of India was actually banked. Only 30% of India had formal banking accounts. The rest of it was unbanked, and the economic rationale behind this policy was that unless they get banked, unless people have formal bank accounts, it's not possible to transfer the government subsidies to them in an open, transparent fashion. He focused on this initiative called Smart Cities, 100 cities to come up in India, many of which will be upgraded existing cities, some of which will be new cities, state-of-art smart cities, which will be kind of the gold standard of urban infrastructure as far as India is concerned. He focused on this initiative of Startup India. Startup India, harnessing on the talent, the entrepreneurial talent that exists among Indian people and enabling them the best of accesses to go ahead. And finally, something which no Prime Minister has talked of ever, no political entity in India has ever talked about, Clean India. And it's very rarely that you come across a Prime Minister talking about open defecation in his address to the country on the 15th of August, which is the the Independence Day of India. And he intends to make India an open defecation-free society, intends to clean up India as much as possible. The core of this cleanup plan is cleaning up the river Ganges. And the enormity of this task is obvious from the fact that I remember I was a part of a conversation in Singapore where Singapore has achieved a certain degree of accomplishment by cleaning up the Singapore River, which is a 7-kilometer stretch, and that was cleaned up over a period of 11 years. So when I said that, well, clean Ganges is in India, they asked me that, how long is the Ganga? I said, to me, I mean, a couple of 100 kilometers this way, that way, 2,500 kilometers. They said, let's stop talking about this. And as a state chief minister who has been running a state for 12 years, there's practically nobody other than Modi who could bring a pronounced state perspective to Delhi when he runs the central government. And this is from where he went on to this concept of cooperative federalism, that the states must need to cooperate between themselves to initiate the kind of economic energy that India requires and for fulfilling its economic goals. So this was modifying India. The most impressive or the most striking part of Mr. Modi over the last 3 to 3.5 years, he rarely spoke about foreign policy when he was campaigning, except for saying that we will teach Pakistan a lesson occasionally in a rhetorical fashion. But his global outreach over the last 3.5 years has been remarkable, particularly the first year. India has shown the proclivity to move from non-alignment, which is practiced earlier, to more of a policy of multi-alignment. It's happy to align with anybody, everybody, depending upon the specific interests. And Mr. Modi is not hesitant to push India into a leadership position when it comes to global agendas, like the climate change, for example. He's happy to take an initiative on that. He's happy to move into distinct global and regional alliances. The SCO is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization with the Central Asian countries, China and Pakistan, which he has taken India onto. He has initiated the International Solar Power Alliance, ISP, 121 countries which have an excess of sun and sunlight, which can be cultivated and harnessed together on both sides of the equator into an international solar power alliance. He has finished the nuclear supply deals with a large number of countries. The first thing that he did upon coming to Australia, the first thing that he did after getting to Canada, he convinced the Japanese. He did so with Argentina. So a lot of these things that were, probably pending at the desk for want of good reasons or bad reasons, he finished. And he has got the UN to successfully declare 8th of June as the International Yoga Day, which becomes India's signature contribution soft power to the international discourse. He has gone and connected to the diaspora in as vibrant and colorful a fashion as possible, including his addresses in New York, in a large number of other places, have actually been likened to rock star performances, the way they have gone and been cultivated. And he has been a proactive Prime Minister. He has upgraded India's look-east policy to an action-oriented actist policy. He would be speaking at major forums. He has spoken, he would. He has given teeth to the larger concept of Indo-Pacific, which includes, among which, India-Australia collaboration on a fairly robust level. So all these are Mr. Modi and its global outreach. I'm afraid the cheers end here. The cheers end here, and now I move on to the challenges. You see, the problem has been, and this is, I think, where those of us who know India partially, at least in terms of the exchanges, communications, the regular visits that we have. And I remember having this conversation with a couple of Congress members of Parliament 5 or 6 months after Mr. Modi came to power. And they told me that the Congress had a very simple recipe for running India. Never allow the expectations of the people to rise above a certain level. Because once you let that happen, they will become unmanageable. Mr. Modi broke the glass ceiling. He promised people things which they never believed that they could be delivered. Let's say, for example, employment. He promised 10 million jobs would be created each year. And this in a country which is adding 12 million young people to its workforce every year. And there are no jobs. Now, based on this assumption and the enormous amount of faith that people invest in Mr. Modi, you now find yourself facing a situation where the unemployment rate is around 8%. That's 2016. The job creation is well below the annual target of 10 million. In fact, jobs are hardly being created. And jobs are getting lost. So it's a three-cornered problem. A, existing jobs are going. B, no new jobs are being created. And 3, there is a challenge of automation. Now, it's a triangular fix, which is not Modi specific. This is a part of the structural changes that Indian economy has gone through, and probably many other countries in the world are going through. But this is what he is encountering. And on the other side is his promise, 10 million jobs and productively engaging the labor force. So what you see over here are these visuals of job fairs where people are queuing up. And these are all pass-outs, young graduates queuing up for enlisting in various kinds of diploma courses, so on and so forth, to make themselves more eligible for the various kinds of jobs that might be available in the market or might be coming up. But the problem over here is that it's not so easy. And what is not so easy becomes further complicated because this kind of a challenge threatens political perpetuity. So what you see is actually two kinds of reactions coming in. One, there's a huge demand for reservations in government jobs that are coming up from various communities across India. One of them from Mr. Modi's own state in Gujarat, where the Patidar community, being led by a young upstart politician called Mr. Hardik Patel, has actually been agitating for more than 2 years now for getting a share of the state government jobs for his community. This picture is from the state of Haryana in India, where the Jats have been demanding jobs for themselves in the state government quota, and the agitations have turned very, very violent. And what you see now is a concomitant reaction coming up from the state governments and state politicians. This gentleman is the Chief Minister of the state of Bihar, Mr. Nitish Kumar, who is now an ally of Mr. Modi. Bihar is one of those states in India which is not only heavily populous, which practically has no industry. And Bihar has been experiencing a large number of outward migration, but nonetheless, matters have reached a stage where the existing population needs to be accommodated meaningfully with some livelihoods provided, and that makes the Bihar Chief Minister say that even when it comes to private sector, you must reserve jobs according to caste and ethnic representation. Now, is it possible? Well, it's a very tricky question. It's a tricky question because when it comes to central government jobs, there is an overarching judgment by the Supreme Court of India that reservations can only include the scheduled castes, other backward castes and scheduled tribes. And there's a fixed number of proportion to which this can go. When it comes to the state governments, the law is ambiguous. So they might actually take this flexibility of getting some quotas inbuilt for people in the local government jobs area. But that's clearly not a long-term or not even a medium-term solution to the jobs crisis in India. And Mr. Modi is now connected with a couple of forceful economic therapies that he administered on the economy. The first is demonetization of the Indian currency. This happened just a little more than a year ago on the 8th of November 2016, when on 12 p.m. at night he went on air announcing that from the next morning 86% of the Indian currency in circulation will not be legally usable anymore. They will not remain legal tender. Now, why was this done? At that time, if one goes back, and a lot has been spoken and written on demonetization since, at that time, if one goes back and looks at the official government narrative, you would find that Mr. Modi's speech, or even the speech of Mr. Arun Jaitley, the finance minister, mentioning the word black money repeatedly over and over again. Arguably, the flushing out of currency was supposed to flush out black money. What was the logic? Let's say if 100 rupees were being made illegal, you would expect that 80 rupees, 70 rupees, 75 rupees would come back to the banks. The old currency would be replaced. And whatever would not come back would be logically taken as the black money. The money could not be returned to the banking system. The problem was, at the end of the day, the money that came back to the banks was actually more than what was demonetized. So obviously the black money logic doesn't hold anymore. So what was the second logic that was taken forward by the government? Take India towards a digitalized economy where there would be less use of cash. It's not cashless, but less cash. There would be more formalization of the informal sector. The problem over here is that all these involve costs. And these costs are substantive to the extent that now there is no doubt about the fact that demonetization has actually hit the trajectory of economic growth. Economic growth was showing signs of a downward movement right from the third quarter of 2015. If one looks at the quarterly GDP growths of India, they have been slowly coming down, but demonetization was a sharp hit. And this sharp hit has now led to a situation where the last quarterly growth for India was 5.7%. So India doesn't remain among the major economies of the world that are the fastest growing. It again goes behind China. But the question is, was this necessary? In the long run, what has it achieved? And then you have the GST, the tax that Mr. Modi describes as the good and simple tax. Not the goods and services tax as it is known. The good and simple tax is supposed to unite the whole federation, 29 states and 7 union territories, under one common indirect tax that will be subjected as far as goods and services are concerned. Well, the fact of the matter is that 40% of the items that fetch revenues for Indian state governments are outside the GST till now. These include petroleum products. This include alcohol for human consumption, this include real estate, and this include electricity services. On the other hand, the GST began not with 1 rate, not with 3 rate, but with 7 rates. The people who were eligible for GST were supposed to subject them to multiple monthly returns. Within 2 months, it was evident that this is not going to work. I mean, it has created an enormous amount of complications. People are backing off from the GST system, trying to avoid it as much as possible. The good part is that since Mr. Modi runs a decisive and proactive government, he has been trying to sort out these issues. So now you get to a situation where the rates are trying to be condensed among themselves. But still, it's way, way too far from being a single administered homogeneous rate for the economy. And there's a lot of political credit that has been taken for the GST, which I think to an extent is due to Mr. Modi's government. But let's not forget the fact that the exercise from GST began actually from 2003. And it's been a long, long process over which this has aped and evolved. What's happening to the farming sector in India? Farmer suicides are not stopping. They're going up, up and up. The bankruptcy of the agricultural sector is kind of as high as it has been over the last 15 to 20 years. And farming distress is actually not directly attributable to Mr. Modi, but if one looks at the fact that he made this commitment that he will be doubling farmers' income within a period of 5 years, you actually need to look back and think that what exactly is going wrong. Over the last 1 year, there have been multiple instances of crop failure which really do not get to be entirely contributed to governments anywhere. There could be weather factors, there could be other factors, but the bulk of these are the factors that because of certain very peculiar price distortions in the agricultural market in India, farmers keep on cultivating as a matter of choice cereals as opposed to non-cereals. And there are several implications of this, but on a number of occasions the cereals don't fetch the returns that they expect because there's an overproduction. Now, in that kind of a situation, the farmers are not in a position to pay back the loans and the debts that they have. So what do? The ones who can't manage take their lives. The ones who have the political clout and can come together as an organized lobby, approach their respective governments, and the governments come down on the banks who have given the loans to these farmers and say, please waive them off. And this from a banking system which is already saddled with huge non-performing loans. So the implication of this is that today in one harvest season, if the banks are forced to waive up their loans, the next year when the farmers go back to the same banks, they simply say, we won't give you loans. And then the banks, what's going on over there? There has been this concern. See, let's get this clear at this stage that India is not China when it comes to tackling banks. Over the last 12 years, China has had several instances of non-performing loans. The Chinese government has recapitalized its banks by simply pushing in cash into the banks 3 times. India does not have the fiscal surplus for doing so. And the banks are in a bad state because they are saddled with loans. They can't give loans. They can't give credit to businesses and investments. And the funny part is that these loans are all being held by the government banks in India. So this to an extent draws attention to the collusion that has existed between businesses who have repeatedly kept on taking loans in spite of not being able to pay them back. And you might be amused to know that failure to pay a loan in India does not get you behind the bars. It's not a penal offense. So you can pretty well pick up a loan citing a purpose and use it for another purpose. So when the banks and their liabilities remain major concerns, Mr. Modi comes up with a scheme which says that the government of India will be issuing bonds which the public sector banks will buy because they are now sitting on a huge pile of cash which they have mobilized from demonetization of the currency. So they buy these bonds and the money comes to the government and the government reflects that money in its balance sheet as capital that it gives to its own banks. So this is a brilliant piece of financial re-engineering which luckily has been identified by many. So the problems with the banks remains by and large what they were. Their shares have got a temporary lease of life, but other than that, the banking sector remains fundamentally saddled with the loans which they had, and the loans which they hold have no chances of coming back. And there's a gentleman by the name of Vijay Mallya who is actually talked about as being one of the biggest offenders. Let me assure you, he is nowhere close to what many other offenders are, whose names are not in the public domain. Now, governance was supposed to be a major platform on which the Congress was voted out and on which Mr. Modi was brought in. Mr. Modi's, one of his key slogans when he came in was minimum government, maximum governance. Minimum government was supposed to have been a small cabinet. Well, at the end of 3.5 years, his government has reached the maximum size when it comes to the size of the cabinet, almost 80. When it comes to governance, there are a couple of issues. The first, and which has been a matter of concern, you're free to choose whether one can connect it to the growth of Modi or not, but I think he will have to be held accountable for this to a reason that there's a huge increase in religious vigilantism in India. And the biggest reflection of that is in the reaction surrounding cows. That cows are taken holy and they can't be slaughtered. Now the point over here is, I think many don't know that cow slaughter is actually a state subject in India. It's not in the domain of the central government. States have their own laws. And except for 3 or 4 states in India, laws exist where cows cannot be slaughtered in other states. It's the buffalo that can be slaughtered. But anyway, so when you look at the cattle, you can't really distinguish between cows and buffaloes if you want to be a vigilante, right? So what this essentially means is that anybody identified with even the remotest impression that he could be a consumer of the cow is being attacked. Now, this has a tremendous implication on the bovine economy. Imagine a farmer who is a part of the dairy economy and owns a cow. How long does the cow yield for him? 8 years, 10 years, 11 years. After that, what does he do with the cow? The easiest option for the farmer is to offload the cow in the markets where it could be taken forward for slaughter, not only for use as meat in human consumption, but also for the hide that goes into the leather industry, which India has in a pretty big scale. If the farmer is not allowed to do this, if slaughter is banned, he's left with the cow. Left with the cow to take care of it for the rest of its life, which one doesn't know how long it will be. Now, most farmers in such a state won't be able to hold on to the cow. They would let them loose. So you will have this very large number of stray cows moving around. So either the cows increase on the roads or the cows are kept as non-performing assets with great implications for the economy and the bovine economy. So if this is not a governance issue, I'm not really sure what is a governance issue, but I have one better example on cooperative federalism, and that is this visual, which is not very clear to you. I can see it pretty clearly. It's the Delhi pollution, and the wonder of wonders is the birds still flock to Delhi, and there are birds which are on this picture. And it's the Delhi pollution, a photo taken 2 weeks ago, and this season Delhi has beaten its own records when it comes to pollution. What exactly is going on? 4 states, Punjab, Haryana, UP, and take Delhi as a state because it has an assembly. 4 states, 4 governments, 4 chief ministers, all tweeting among each other. Nobody knows whose responsibility this is. Now, how are 4 states involved? Well, Delhi is at the receiving end of the pollution. Delhi is contributing to the pollution in terms of the dust that it has, the industries that it has around it. But the biggest contribution to pollution is coming from the burning of stubble in nearby Punjab, Haryana, and UP. And why is the stubble being burnt? Because farmers are switching from paddy to wheat cultivation, and the turnaround time is very short. So the amount which they had put in terms of paddy stubble obviously has been overcapacity. But now they realize that the wheat season harvest is coming up and they have to switch it fast. So what do you do with the stubble that you have acquired? You burn it, producing an enormous amount of biomass, right? According to last count, 2.3 million metric tons of stubble were burnt, and let me assure you, more is to come. Another 11 million is in store. Now, by the time this 11 million is burnt, one really doesn't know what will happen to Delhi, but Delhi is resilient, it will survive. But the fact of the matter is that who is to take the responsibility for clearing this? If Mr. Modi talks about cooperative federalism, it is important for him to be a decisive Prime Minister because he lives in Delhi. He cannot now anymore take umbrage to the fact that I am non-Delhi. His cabinet is functioning out of Delhi. It's the central government, and there's not a single statement that has come out from the central government anywhere on how this can be handled. Now, to me, this is a way serious problem, and I'll tell you why this is a serious problem. It's a serious problem because it does not have any political appeal for anybody. Nobody is going to win an election because his or her government has handled pollution. So it just is left idle. And it's not a new problem. So if one looks at takeaways, and just a few takeaways to share with you in a general sense, it's kind of clear that Mr. Modi's proclivity is more towards a presidential style of functioning, where he is more interested and more attuned to taking decisions, if not at an individual level, as a part of a team. And these are decisions which need not necessarily be taken to the Parliament to be thrashed, debated and, vetted. He is happy to take decisions outside the domain of the Parliament, which is more in tune with the presidential style of government. In fact, his majority in the lower house allows him to do that. It gives the executive much more power than it had earlier vis-a-vis the legislature. Where he does not have the majority yet now is the upper house of the Parliament. So that's why the state elections in India are extremely important for him, which nominate the MPs to the upper house. There's been an incredible focus on image. In fact, The Economist for the last 1.5 years has turned increasingly critical of Mr. Modi, and its last headline on Mr. Modi says he's a Prime Minister who focuses only on appearances. This appearance shock first came when in his first meeting with President Obama, he wore a pinstripe suit which had his name in all the stripes. Let's not get into the budget for that suit. So the image makeover from soft to bold. Manmohan Singh had only one attire. I mean, those of you who would remember Manmohan Singh would remember him in his kurta pajama, nothing else, or at best his galaband coat. But Mr. Modi has been a fashion icon by his own right. And something has changed with the BJP. What has changed with the BJP? Many of you might have read an autobiography of the earlier Indian Prime Minister, Mr. P.V. Narasimha Rao, who gets much less credit for what he did with the Indian economy in terms of economic reforms. This is an autobiography called The Half Lion. Now, in this, there are parts of conversation which he has had with the earlier Indian Prime Minister, Mr. Vajpayee, and where there are repeated allusions to the fact that Mr. Vajpayee says, look, the BJP is a party with a difference. We are not going to do what the Congress did. We are not going to poach people. We are not going to get the corrupt people from other regional parties into our party to bolster our ranks and preserve political perpetuity. Now, all these are no more valid for the BJP. BJP is very happy, to openly quote, to pick up partners who have shady pasts, who have been parts of the Congress. There are enormous examples visible. The biggest example is a state like Assam, my own state Bengal, where this is visible, the northeastern part of India. And it's an unabashed move because BJP clearly is on its way with a mission to establish itself as the default political party of India, a position which for long has been held by the Congress. And finally, do you have a right to privacy in India or not? I think this is a question which is going to loom larger and larger as one looks at India moving ahead, because very serious debates are emerging on the government's role in collecting information on citizens. And this is just not for ensuring public services. When the unique identity number was issued earlier, the first time in India, is what meant to ensure secure delivery of public services. Today, matters have gone to a very different stage where, I'm not joking, if you die, you need a unique identity number. Otherwise you can't die under normal circumstances. I mean, that's what the legislation would actually take you to believe. Forget about linking your bank accounts with the unique identity number or the mobile numbers. Now, I'm in a great fix because I'm a non-resident Indian. Technically, I'm not supposed to get a resident number, but I'm supposed to link my bank account. So I'll give you another presentation on that later, on my experiences. But what I now end with are certainly not the last words. Mr. Modi continues to remain hugely, hugely popular. So if you go by the Pew ratings, I'm not too sure how much of faith one should put on those ratings, but according to the Pew ratings, 81% of India still would prefer Mr. Modi as the Prime Minister. Now, we might argue, why is so? One of the options could be that there's no viable alternative. The other option could be that the people still have their faith in Mr. Modi. They still think that he's trying hard. The interesting part is, and this is where I have, again, going by the survey results, the same Pew survey also has two other very interesting findings. One is 55% Indians have their faith in a strong leader. They prefer a strong leader. Now, how you interpret a strong leader is a very different question. 53% of Indians don't mind military rule in the country. This is a new India. Right, so be careful. And there's considerable international support for his economic policies. The World Bank has credited him enormously for the economic steps that he has taken, including the doing business improvements. The Moody's have just come out with an upgraded rating of India's domestic currency, the first upgrade in the last 14 years. And if you connect this to the fact that the Moody's downgraded China's domestic currency for the first time in the last 30 years, so you know who is calling the shots. The dragon might be turning vegetarian down the line. But there are distinct anxieties, and three very, very important anxieties, the ones that I would like to emphasize on at the end. The first is the fiscal stress. I think Mr. Modi now is at a stage where he really does not have the liver to compromise on fiscal stability anymore, but he doesn't have an option. Why? A, the banks are not working. B, on the GST, there is a very strange commitment that he has given to the states. The commitment is that post GST, if the revenues of the state are lower than what they were before, the central government would compensate them. And he has produced a GST structure which is inherently complicated, and many in India consider this to be inflationary. So the government is madly rushing to bring down items, goods and services from a high bracket to a low bracket. So from 28% to 18%. And now, post GST amendment, it's a common indirect tax base from which the center and the states would be drawing their resources. So what that means is, inflation is under control, people are made happy, state governments are fine, but the center retains that responsibility that I have to compensate you and the revenues are falling. So from where he mobilizes these resources, he has to think through. And he had a 18 to 24 month great windfall gain when he came to power, and that was in form of global oil prices. This cushion doesn't remain with him anymore. The oil prices are moving northward, fairly sharp. India's crude oil imports are going to become pricier. India has started importing extensively crude oil from the United States of America. So all these do not really point to a very healthy fiscal situation. Jobs. If there's one problem in India today which one needs to highlight, which has the potential of not only wrecking the economy hard, but also creating socio-political tensions, it's jobs. Frankly, this is not Mr. Modi's creation. The problem has been hanging there for a very long time. The problem has come to a stage where there are several forces which are beyond the control of national governments, but Mr. Modi has to take some accountability for the way he's taking these things forward. It's a serious problem. Finally, social stability. What kind of India are we actually getting to see in a social form? Now, this is a very interesting question in terms of the fact that the character of the Indian polity has changed significantly. In terms of the fact that there is a clear preference for strong leaders and leaders who dominate. This is not only just exemplified through Mr. Modi, this is exemplified through a large number of state government leaders who are coming up. And there are agendas which are in a sense socially powerful but damaging agendas which are gaining traction at the local level and at the subnational level for political capital. Now, whether all these have increased during Modi's tenure, I suppose if one looks at it objectively, one has to say mostly yes. So I leave it there. Happy to take on any questions that you have. Thank you.